On behalf of the School of Arts and Sciences and Department of Politics here at the Catholic University of America, let me welcome you to tonight's lecture. This is an event to mark this year's observance of Constitution Day. My name is Larry Coos. I'm Dean of Arts and Sciences. I'm very happy to be here to introduce the speaker and to welcome you to this event. Let me say a few words about Constitution Day. You may not be familiar with the day or the term, and you may not know some of the history of the day. A recent and very widely quoted survey of high school students in America has provided a lot of wonderful fodder for joke writers and columnists. This survey tried to measure how much high school students in America actually know about the U.S. Constitution. Maybe you've seen some of this. If so, I apologize, but it's pretty good. Some of the results were 25.5% of the students polled knew that Philadelphia was where the Constitution was written. 75.2% knew what city was coterminous with the zip code 90210. 25% of the students knew that the Fifth Amendment was written to protect against double jeopardy, self-incrimination, the right to a grand jury, due process, and compensation for private property taken for public use, at least until a recent Supreme Court decision. 63.7% knew that the club was designed to protect against car theft. 41.2% of the students polled knew the names of the three branches of government. 59.2% knew the names of the Three Stooges. You can imagine the fun that some people had with these results, and you've heard plenty of things like this before. If you follow politics at all, you can imagine that Robert Byrd, Democratic senator from West Virginia, a lifelong booster for promoting knowledge about the American Constitution, had something to say about it too. In December 2004, in true Washington style, as an afterthought, an add-on to an appropriations bill, Senator Byrd sponsored a notice of implementation of Constitution Day. According to this implementation, Constitution Day, which had been promoted by private individuals for almost a decade before then, would thenceforth be celebrated every year on September 17th, which is the day in 1787 when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met for the last time in Philadelphia to sign the document they created. The bill also mandated that every educational institution that receives federal government aid from the Department of Education, which of course means pretty much all of them, should hold a program or event with the aim of encouraging knowledge of the Constitution each year on Constitution Day, or if the 17th fell on a weekend, as it did this year, sometime during the week before or the week after. Now, lots of people found this very ironic, because they believed that the 10th Amendment, included among the powers delegated to the states and the people, was education. There was some controversy, as you can imagine, involved in the very act of the federal government legislating to mandate an educational program promoting knowledge of the Constitution. I love paradoxes, especially if they're historical. So for that reason, I'm very pleased we're able to sponsor a talk on the historical origins of a mix of ideas and theoretical underpinnings of the American Constitution tonight. I'm doubly pleased that we are able to introduce a speaker ideally suited to the topic, Professor Stephen Schneck. Professor Schneck earned his bachelor's degree from Rockhurst College and his master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Notre Dame. He joined the faculty of the Catholic University of America in 1984, first as an adjunct professor, and was tenured and promoted to the rank of associate professor in 1990. He's currently serving his second tour of duty as the chair of the Department of Politics, our biggest. Professor Schneck has written and taught widely in the fields of historical and contemporary political theory, in American politics, and in the European political tradition, and in political philosophy. And from his first year on this campus till now, students continue to rate him as one of the very best teachers at the university. Professor Schmeck's title is The Origins and Ideas of the 1787 Constitution.
Thank you, Larry. That was very gracious. I really appreciate that. And comments about the students' knowledge of the Constitution was particularly a good way to start this discussion. I'd actually thought when Dean Cruz asked me to do this, and we were talking about what kind of food and so forth to serve in the back there, actually it occurred to me that it might be kind of interesting to have oysters served. And the reason I mention this is because in many ways, well, you could say that the one origin of the Constitution, there are many ways of thinking about the origin of the Constitution. The one origin of the Constitution comes from a concern over oysters. In early 1780, along the Chesapeake Bay, Delaware Bay, along the lower Potomac, there was an oyster war going on among the various states. Maryland, Virginia, even Pennsylvania and Delaware were all part of this, and it actually succeeded in becoming moderately violent at times because they were fighting over crabs and oysters and so forth. And in 1784, a young delegate to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation named James Madison suggested that a conference should be held among the four states that were warring with one another about these oysters in the bay and so forth. A conference be held to try to resolve the matter. And so it was set for the summer of 1785. And the meeting place ostensibly was George Washington's Mount Vernon estate, just, of course, very close to us here. And one of the things we should do here in Washington, by the way, is to take advantage of these kinds of things. So the summer of 1785, delegates from the four states gathered at Mount Vernon. In fact, they did much of their work, politicians being what politicians are, they did much of their work at the taverns in Alexandria rather than at the official sessions at the Mount Vernon estate. But they struggle over this issue of coming up with some kind of rules or procedures to resolve the conflict that they had over oysters and crabs in the Chesapeake Bay and Lower Potomac and so forth. They didn't succeed. And they didn't succeed in large part because government under the Articles of Confederation really did not have a mechanism for resolving those kinds of conflicts between the states. Something interesting, though, happened. And here I'd like to think that it's where these interesting things happen. Well, we're in the taverns in Alexandria rather than in the official sessions at Mount Vernon. The delegates began to talk among themselves about the deficiencies of government under the Articles of Confederation. They began to raise questions about the then Constitution. If you think about it, that's actually pretty extraordinary. They began to question, really in fairly profound ways, the legitimacy of the government under which they were operating. Madison and some of these other delegates, in fact, decided among themselves to petition Congress to authorize a second conference for the following summer. Again, right around here, right up the road at Annapolis. In fact, if you have a chance, how many of you have been to Annapolis before? If you have a chance to go to Annapolis and can go to the old State House, this is literally where they met in 1785. This time, delegates came from 10 states. Including northeastern states. And it's a much broader conference. Ostensibly, again, the primary issue was regulation of fisheries and so forth. But the real action was on the side at the so-called Annapolis Convention. The real arguments were, once again, about the power of government under the Articles of Confederation, the nature of what would be an effective and legitimate form of government given the kinds of given the inability to resolve the sorts of things that these oyster wars were revealing. Much else, by the way, was happening than oyster wars. This is about the time that Daniel Shays up in New England is leading a ragtag army of former Revolutionary War soldiers who have risen up over the fact that the government under the Articles of Confederation is not paying off on the script that they were issued. for their conduct as soldiers during the war, were rising up in a kind of a populist uprising against the government. And under the Articles of Confederation, it was clear that there was no power in the national government to deal with this kind of crisis, much less the smaller oyster war sorts of things that were happening. In fact, the discussion in Congress as a result of Shays' Rebellion was to call up the Virginia militia and bring old George Washington out of retirement and sail them up to Massachusetts and put the Shays' Rebellion down with the Virginia militia. Fortunately, it never came to that. But it reveals, I think, something interesting about the nature of governance at this particular time. That message isn't lost on these conventioneers in Annapolis in the summer of 1785. It's more than anything else, it's those kinds of things that are causing their thinking to distill in certain ways. So, again, this time, once again, James Madison is a central part of it, but with him, a young, fairly new attorney in New York named Alexander Hamilton joins with him in urging the delegates at the Annapolis Convention to call for a more thoroughgoing convention to consider the nature of government under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, they petitioned Congress again. This time, they petitioned Congress to call a convention where revisions to the Articles of Confederation themselves would be considered. Congress grants that request, and so in the summer of 1787, they gather in Philadelphia. Before that happens, in the fall of 1786, in the winter of 1787, James Madison, supported by people like Alexander Hamilton, start doing something even far beyond merely thinking about revisions or revising the Articles of Confederation. Madison begins to study the history of Republican government in the West. He looks at the experiments of the ancient Greek world in places like Athens and Corinth and so forth. He looks at the city-state governments of Renaissance Italy, places like Florence in its Republican days, and Venice under the Doges and so forth. He looks at the Swiss cantons, he looks at the Dutch Confederation, he looks at a number at the history, really, of Republican forms of government in the West, and considers these historical examples in the hopes of gaining some insight on not just revisions to the Article of Confederation, but some insight into doing it completely right. In that process, he actually puts together a whole new constitution. That is, over the fall of 1786, the winter of 1787, a constitution is written by James Madison, supported by people like Alexander Hamilton. All the while, Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, has issued a call to the state legislatures up and down the Atlantic seaboard to send delegations to arrive in Philadelphia to consider revisions to the Constitution. The delegates arrive. Madison and his conspirators is probably too strong a word. Madison and his fellow activists have decided among themselves on a plan of action to deal with this convention that's being held. And so, as soon as the delegations from the various states, and by the way, 12 states, Rhode Island being Rhode Island, doesn't send anybody. It's kind of still true about Rhode Island, I suppose. Doesn't send anybody, but the other states all send delegations. When they get there, they're asked to take an oath of secrecy. They're asked to make a promise that they won't speak to members of the press, that they won't contact people back in their state legislatures from which they've been authorized to be part of the delegation. Even they're asked not to communicate with members of their family about the nature of the proceedings that take place in Philadelphia. To make it even, I guess, kind of more saucy, they sealed the windows in the old State House now, which, of course, again, is not far from here, a place that you should go and visit as well up in Philadelphia. They sealed the windows. It's interesting to imagine, summer in Philadelphia. Anybody here from Philadelphia? Summer in Philadelphia, along the river. They're dressed in woolen clothes. The windows are sealed. Probably a lot of pipe smoke in the air. Get the sense that the origin of the Constitution, the historical origin of the Constitution, had what shall we call it, a sweet aroma to it as it was being drafted. So they meet in Philadelphia, and immediately after these oaths and so forth are taken, the windows are sealed, the woolen clothes start to get their beautiful aroma and so forth. Immediately, Madison and his activist friends arranged to have a prominent politician from the Virginia delegation named Edmund Randolph submit this Constitution, this whole, not revisions, not amendments to the Constitution, but a whole new Constitution to the assembled gathering. And as you can imagine, there's a tremendous amount of consternation when this is done. Some delegates, in fact, immediately refuse to get involved in the process and leave the convention. Others intrigued, stay. And over the course of the summer, through a variety of compromises and other people taking their leaves and going back to their delegations, back to their states in a huff and so forth, finally, over the course of the summer, the Constitution that we now call the 1787 Constitution, the Constitution that we have today, results. By and large, that Constitution is pretty much, at least in theoretical terms, pretty much the same Constitution that Madison puts together largely by himself in those months in the fall of 1786 and the winter of 1787 leading up to this Constitutional Convention. I go through all of this because it's really fascinating how the historical, in this case, the historical events that led to the Constitution map so well with the theoretical ideas that are embodied in this Constitution. Let me explain just a little bit of it. Under the Articles of Confederation, the perception of people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton was that there was a democratic effervescence occurring in political life up and down the Atlantic seaboard. The revolution, the nature of the revolution, had of course valorized and celebrated liberty. And the document most associated with that revolution, the Declaration of Independence, talks in really extraordinarily powerful words about all human beings being equal, about being endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The emphasis on equality that you see there, and the emphasis on liberty that the revolution itself, was all about, left a legacy, created an ambiance in the political life of early America that had, as I suggest, a kind of a exuberant democratic effervescence. With that, though, came certain problems. In most of the state legislatures during this particular period, as a result, perhaps, of this kind of ambiance that I'm describing, you see the emergence of what we'll later call in political science machine politics. For example, in New York, a powerful machine is organized around the Clintons, different Clintons, the Hillary and Bill, organized around the Clintons, where trading political favors and so forth, operating in this new, wide open, environment of political and liberty that followed the revolution, corruption and really a kind of a dangerous series of public policy decisions are made that even come to threaten things like basic rights, including the rights of property. New York is just one example of this. The same thing is happening in other places. In Massachusetts, during this period, a similar kind of machine is organized around John Hancock and some of his followers. In Virginia, the Carters and the Lees have basically, arranged Virginia politics in machine fashion around the interests of those two families. Madison looks at this, and not just Madison. People like Hamilton and some of these other activists as well look at these sorts of things, and they're reminded of the sorts of things that Madison discovered in his analysis and his study of the Republican forms of government in places like Venice and like Florence in its Republican times, and like the republics of the ancient Greek world. What Madison saw in his study of these places is that a couple of things seem to almost automatically go hand in hand with democratic exuberance. One is corruption and decay. Mob-like, circus-like atmosphere in which self-interest, the self-interests of all of the citizens participating in this process somehow loses its bearings and brings about anarchy and disorder, such that, and here particularly Madison is thinking about the ancient world, it seemed like democratic exuberance could really lead in the direction of tyranny. You know how that might, can you see how that might happen? That is, in the disorder and the anarchy and the overabundance, really, of a politics of self-interest, the public order breaks down such that a kind of a vacuum is created in democratic exuberance, out of which Madison and Hamilton and so forth, and lots of other thinkers before them, saw the likely path toward a tyrant, toward someone riding in on a white horse and saying, I'll bring about order in this situation. I'll solve these problems. Give me your votes and so forth, and that becomes the mechanism. In several of the states during this period as well, the response to the democratic exuberance has an interesting religious overtone. The Protestant ministers in this particular period look at the effects of the overabundance of liberty that they see in the period under the Articles of Confederation. And if you look through their lectures and their homilies and their writings from this period, a good number of them are arguing, similarly to Madison and to Hamilton, that there's not only a decadence in politics, but that decadence is having a kind of an impact on social and cultural life. That the political ambiance of the time is overflowing into the private lives of citizens of this particular period. The response that most of these folks argued for this is a response that most of these religious writers in the period, the response that they proposed to deal with this situation was a response based on the idea of civic virtue. Civic virtue. Civic virtue is a mechanism of educating citizens to bind their self-interests to the common good. It's a way of encouraging citizens to develop in themselves a kind of a virtue so that they could be trusted to lead good political lives. if we look through the history of political philosophy, if we go back to Aristotle, if we look at the 18th century thinker Montesquieu, we can see that by and large, the problem of democratic liberty and democratic exuberance had usually been approached, looking for a solution, had usually been approached from the perspective of this civic virtue. So that Montesquieu, writing in his Spirit of the Laws in the 18th century, a book, by the way, that's tremendously influential on the Founding Fathers' generation. Writing in the Spirit of Laws, Montesquieu argues the solution to the problem of democratic exuberance is to create ways in which the state, or religion, or other aspects of society can inculcate in citizens the kinds of virtues so that citizens could be trusted with the extraordinary power, with the open horizon of possibilities that comes with participatory forms of government. Madison is familiar with these kinds of arguments. So too is Alexander Hamilton. So too, in fact, are most of the framers. The interesting thing, though, is that the people who actually write our Constitution, the architects of the Constitution, people like Hamilton and Madison, ultimately reject that classic solution to the problem of democratic exuberance. Now, there's a second way of thinking about these things that's particularly in the air in the 18th century. Perhaps the figure that's most classically associated is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but it really is in the air in the 18th century. Many other people would make this argument as well. Rousseau thought there was no problem of democratic exuberance. He was convinced that if only we could really provide to citizens true liberty, absolutely unconstrained liberty, combined with the justice of genuine equality, liberty and equality together, if we could really create a condition of liberty and equality, that in that condition human beings would naturally be virtuous, would automatically be virtuous. You didn't need to have the state inculcate virtue in citizens. You didn't need to have the church trying to preach virtue to its citizens. But instead, automatically, in a situation of sufficient liberty and equality, citizens would be automatically good, automatically virtuous, and therefore could be utterly trusted with the kind of power that citizens have in democratic and participatory forms of government. In a sense, those kind of are the limits, or those are nice little landmarks, theoretical landmarks to consider here as we approach the problem that the framers thought that they were wrestling with in this period of a democratic effervescence after the Revolution during the Articles of Confederation. On one hand, they seem to have these older notions of a way to solve the problem by instilling civic virtue in the citizen. On the other, they have this more modern call from Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau, who suggested, no, don't worry about it. Just grant the citizens sufficient liberty and equality, and automatically you'll get the kind of order and good government, that we're looking for. Madison's experience, Hamilton's experience, the framers' experience, the framers and the people who put this Constitution together, was that neither one of those solutions seemed to be appropriate. The fact of the matter, the facts on the ground in the state legislatures, in Congress under the Articles of Confederation, was that neither of these solutions seemed to be working. In fact, if anything, the slide in the direction that Madison thought that he saw in the ancient republics and the ancient democracies and the medieval republics and the Renaissance republics, and that slide in the direction of anarchy and perhaps ultimately tyranny seemed to be occurring in 18th century United States. I suggested that they did something different. Now I need to give you the grounds for their response to this. And if anybody saw some of the little blurbs that went around for this talk, you know the grounds that I'm talking about. I'm going to argue that there are four theoretical elements that are at work in the thinking of the framers who put this Constitution together, and that these four theoretical elements intertwine in interesting ways even today in the Constitution that we've inherited. Now, those four elements are as follows, and I'm not listing these in any particular order. I'm not suggesting that there's a kind of a pecking order of some sort, or that one is more or less important than another. The first is Protestant theology. The second is English liberalism. The third is Whig constitutionalism. And the fourth is Scottish political economy. These are clusters of ideas. These aren't single ideas. These are clusters of ideas. And Madison and Hamilton and the framers of the U.S. Constitution are very much in debt to these four elements, theoretical elements. Let me explain, kind of go through a few of these. All of these are worth, honestly. Some of you have heard these lectures before. I see Brad there. I know he's heard these lectures before. Patrick over there, I know he's heard these lectures before. All of these topics are worthy of 2 or 3 lectures at least, if not whole books. But let me just kind of give you a taste of the implications of these elements for the political thought of the U.S. Constitution. Protestant theology, the key aspect of Protestant theology for this particular discussion is the extraordinary weight that Protestant theology gives to sin in a way that Catholics, I think, often have a hard time understanding. For Luther, for Calvin, and so forth, sin is so powerfully corrosive, so inescapable in the human condition, that we can't count on human beings being able to transcend it in public life. For example, so powerful is sin that human beings, Protestant theologians are convinced, are incapable of putting together institutions that are fundamentally good in and of themselves. Institutions magnify and multiply the sinful character of the citizens who are part of them. And therefore, government, for Protestant theology, government is incapable of orienting itself toward the common good in the way that's so much characteristic of Catholic approaches to those kinds of questions. I've already indicated that the Protestant ministers and priests and so forth up and down the Atlantic seaboard are, during this period of the Articles of Confederation, caught up in pointing out the excesses, the rising sinfulness of Americans during this particular period. Madison and Hamilton and the framers are caught up in this as well. And based on this, based on the implications of Protestant theology for their thought, they come to the conclusion that, well, certainly Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Enlightenment thinkers are dead wrong. Human beings aren't capable of living naturally virtuous, naturally good lives. Even if given the sort of, in fact, it would even be worse if they had the kind of liberty and equality that people like Rousseau would suggest. So the Rousseau solution they quickly discard. But they also discard the old solution. And that's, I think, really interesting. They take to heart, and you can't miss it, those of you who have had a chance to read the Federalist Papers, Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Federalist 49, Federalist 16, Federalist 9. Those are some of the key Federalist Papers to get at this. These were written by people, these were written, in fact, by Hamilton and Jay and Madison to encourage people to sign on and to endorse this Constitution. those Federalist Papers reveal how profoundly this Protestant conception of sin, this Protestant conception of the human person, influences their thought. They're convinced that not only is Rousseau wrong to hope for human beings to be naturally good and virtuous, and thereby we can trust them with democratic power, they also think that Aristotle was wrong, that Montesquieu was wrong. So sinful are human beings, so corrupt, so focused on the self, so motivated by self-interest and private passions, they're convinced that civic virtue can't even hold this quality, this dangerous quality of human life back. So they turn their back then on all of these more traditional approaches to dealing with the problem of democratic exuberance. Rousseau's tossed out civic virtue is not entirely, but significantly tossed out as well by these things. Now so there you get a sense of how Protestant theology fits into this doctrine. Okay? That it comes to be called the Federalist conception of the human person, but it's really Protestant theology. That's at work. There's a lot of other aspects of Protestant theology that we can talk about, but you'll have to come and take one of my classes to get that. The second thing that I mentioned, though, was I mentioned English liberalism. And this, of course, English liberalism is the way of thinking that is most associated, really, with the theories behind the Revolution. You know, the young Alexander Hamilton, a student at what was then called King's College, which is now Columbia in New York, writes a series of articles, based on John Locke and so forth, that based on this kind of English liberalism. English liberalism comes from Locke, comes from people like Trenchard and Gordon and so forth. This thinking emphasizes individual rights. Emphasizes, even more than individual rights, it emphasizes popular sovereignty. That the only government that's legitimate is a government that flows or that finds its source in the sovereignty of the people. And therefore, government needs to be